So, good night, everyone. Happy New Year. Tonight, I'll be talking about our work related to chatbots that came out of one of the CIBC projects from earlier last year. For CIBC, we did a stepping stone set of chatbots that got increasingly complicated. And so we did it in that way so that we could focus on the business benefit and make it easier for them to implement by following along that path. So for this paper, the main difference is that we focused on the parts of the work that had educational benefit to people. And we would have highlighted the thoughts and decisions that would have gone into that part of it. And that's the main difference between what we presented for CIBC last year and what we wrote up and presented for this conference. So to briefly go over the agenda, we'll firstly put forward the motivation for the work. So, but I mean, what types of financial decisions, why and who we're trying to focus on. And then we'll look at the specific objectives that were derived based on that motivation. Under the research approach, we'll describe how we set out to accomplish those objectives, then the results of that approach, and lastly, we'll conclude and discuss some future work. So the importance of financial education that can't really be understated. A lack of financial literacy, it leads to poor decision-making, which in turn leads to impulsivity, poor debt management, and ultimately just over-indebtedness. And these poor decisions can have a very lasting and detrimental impact on the lives of especially young and low-income adults. Therefore, having a means of high-quality financial education that's inclusive and accessible by all becomes very important. It's important to note that there are many online sources for financial education today, but content alone or the consumption of content alone does not imply significant behavioral change, because although you might know better, is that really enough to break bad habits and form good ones? So this changes the objective from just providing education to providing education in a way that encourages real actionable change. Thus, it drives up the importance of convenience, accessibility, the quality of the user experience, and incentivized use through practical benefits. Based on this, we can summarize the objectives of our work to be, firstly, providing a flexible and extendable base platform for a means of accessible financial education. And secondly, designing that means of education in a way that's convenient, user-friendly, and encourages actionable change. So our approach towards these objectives comprises of three things specifically: a means of financial education through a foundational finance chatbot, then scenario-based functions that are designed around just-in-time education and nudge theory to provide education in a way that encourages change, and lastly, an evaluation of the system and scenarios for learning via a survey with 63 participants. So when we talk about convenience and user-friendliness, the technology through which the users interact or interface with the educational content is incredibly important. So for this, we chose chatbots, and we did that for three main reasons. One, the simplicity of the interface. It's a messaging interface. There's very little components learning, very little components going on to learn, and most people are already accustomed to it. Secondly, the impact it has on the way users think about their intent, because it's through natural language. So they get to focus on what they want rather than remembering or figuring out a specific how. And thirdly, chatbots bring many options for integration. It can exist in a standalone app by some trusted entity, or it could be integrated into a popular social media platform. So you could have that trade-off between trust and convenience. And those platforms especially young adults are very familiar with them, probably a lot easier to get into for them there. They're also very likely to be frequently using those platforms already. And that drastically improves our convenience and user friendliness, two of our most important attributes to consider. So this convenience can then facilitate just-in-time education, which is where we want the lessons to be based on the scenarios the users are actually in and like what they need in the moment. So this allows for more memorable lessons with real incentives, and it also sets up a chance for applying nudge theory. And nudge theory is where our scenario-based education can take advantage of the fact that it's in the moment. So a nudge is just a well-timed, simple, optional suggestion that's geared towards preventing debt-inducing or poor financial decisions. Because remember, this is where impulsivity and spur-of-the-moment poor decisions would happen. So not only is it the ideal moment for education, it's also the ideal time to encourage better behavior, to start breaking poor habits with the support of logical information, incentives, reminders, and sound mathematics. So now we've established why we want to use chatbots and why scenario-based education and suggestions. So the foundation of this is a base financial chatbot. Its primary functions are to help users define their budget, easily maintain transaction history, assuming it's an environment that doesn't already have access to this, like a social media platform, and to provide access to just simple queries of that budget in relation to the transactions they've been making. So like what the status of their budget is, that kind of thing. So this is the architecture of that base chatbot. We used Facebook Messenger as the front interface because it's a popular platform and it's easy to set up. But it's important to note that this component can be swapped out with other social media platforms or custom solutions that have a heavier focus on, security and user trust. So the user interacts with the chatbot through Facebook Messenger, then using Messenger's API to programmatically receive those messages. Google's dialog flow can classify the user's intent. So what are they trying to do? What are they asking about? That's the intent. And it can identify entities in the message that we care about. So what are the key pieces of information we need from what they said? And all this info is then passed to our cloud functions, which interacts with the data store. And these functions are ultimately what produce the end response that goes back to the the response that the chatbot returns to the user on Facebook. So it all gets passed back to them on Messenger. So that base chatbot and its architecture is designed to be extendable, and we extend it to facilitate our scenarios for learning, which we call our use cases. And these use cases were formulated with the help of appropriate people from CIBC who made comments on the types of questions they prioritize based on what people ask the most online and that kind of stuff. So the first use case is luxury affordability. And this is about estimating how much a luxury purchase would go over the user's budget and the potential interest that debt can incur. The second is budget tracking, which looks at estimating whether or not the user is quote unquote on track to stay within their budget using projections based on their history. Small transaction affordability focuses on day-to-day transactions and the impact they have on their ability to stay on track for their budget. An example of this on the right here is like the question like, how much can I spend on lunch today? Because that's the type of small transaction that can add up and would impact your ability to stay on track. Loan affordability is about estimating the duration for someone to pay off a loan if they were to take it. And it estimates how much they would save if they, instead of taking it, waited and saved up their money. And lastly, savings estimate uses the average savings from the available history to estimate a savings amount for a given period of time. Again, an example of the user's perspective on this is shown on the right. So to evaluate our approach, we used a survey with 63 participants. We used convenience sampling. However, the participants generally fit our target. In the survey, for each designed use case, we described the functionality and provided an example of the user perspective, like we showed before. And participants were asked to rate its usefulness from 1 to 5. We then asked questions gauging interest in whether or not people would actually use the chatbot, as well as gauging belief in whether or not this tool can be of help to them. Lastly, we included open-ended questions on what decisions they need help with. So what types of financial decisions people find, or they find most troublesome, and what types of financial decisions they would specifically want the support of sound mathematics to make with. In terms of results, most use cases received positive ratings. The lowest rated was luxury affordability. We think this is because it was the most complicated scenario to show in a single exchange. And it's also kind of a type of decision people would naturally put a lot of thought into to begin with. So the results were similarly positive for gauging interest, with 73 and 83% of participants responding yes to the intent to use, as well as the belief in usefulness of the tool. Lastly, upon analyzing the open-ended responses, we found that the most frequently mentioned decisions participants want help with are recommendations for budget allotment. So people were concerned about what's normal and how to know if they're spending too much. There was also some interest in practical advice or education around investments. People asked about recommendations for savings opportunities based on sound math and their transaction history. And lastly, more assistance with in the moment spending decisions was also a common theme. So for the most part, these align quite well with the direction of the scenarios we've designed so far. So in conclusion, we provided the design and architecture of a flexible base platform for financial education through a finance chatbot. We designed use cases around just-in-time education and nudge theory. These were functions for scenario-based learning and relevant suggestions for providing memorable education and encouraging behavioral change. Lastly, we evaluated the tool through a survey that showed a general positive public response to the concept and the use cases. And in terms of future work, well, a major flaw with that very evaluation is that it didn't include real hands-on use. If the user experience is so important, then that is also very important to evaluate. So firstly, future work, a more thorough evaluation is needed, ideally through some distributable prototype. So over time, we can monitor use and changes as well. Next, the quality of the content also needs to be held to a high standard. Therefore, furthering the consultancy and support of the relevant professionals in finance and finance education is another core step. Financial data is also very sensitive and personal, so demonstrating that the tool can exist on more privacy-oriented platforms, custom or otherwise, is also very important. And lastly, gamification has seen a lot of success in educational tools. Duolingo for language learning is a prime example. So exploring how these aspects can be applied here is another route for future work once the more crucial issues have been resolved. So thank you very much for your time and attention. Also, thank you to everyone here who responded to our survey. We really appreciate that. Are there any questions?
Okay, yeah. So yeah, so Nicholas, yeah, let me just make some points first. First of all, thanks, Reshawn, for this presentation. I would like us to TT Lab to be doing more of this type of impactful type of research. I mean, it's no sophisticated mathematics, etc., but it's useful work that helps society and so I'm really hoping we could get more people involved in this type of research. It started off with the CIBC stuff, but this could be applied to lots of different things. People tend to make spur of the moment decisions, lots of times they don't optimize, and we are accustomed to trying to optimize based on different things, probabilities and this and that, but people tend to go based on their gut feeling. So this type of education would be useful. What we had intended is to have this actually use people's account information, but of course that requires a lot more work to have access to the information and security, etc. So we decided to go this route for this. So yeah, so thanks, Reshawn. So Nicholas, you have a question?
Yes. Hello, can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome presentation. Happy New Year to everyone. I was just curious then, if it's doing, I really like the kind of questions and answers that is supported by the platform. So I was wondering, unless I missed it, are you able to log your expenses? Does the chatbot have an idea of how much your expenditure is to be able to give those recommendations?
Yeah, so there would have been just base functionality for creating your budget, making changes to it, logging your expenses, and it would have been stored in a Firestore and identified using their public Facebook ID.
Oh, that's really cool. So then I guess you're thinking along the lines of, because I saw you had things, do you have a sort of experience where you kind of could opt for permission? Hey, can I spend $40 on KFC today? And then the app is like, okay, yeah, you can, but it's Cricks next week.
So that's kind of what the small transaction use case is going for, yeah.
Yeah, that's really cool. Thanks.
Thanks.
Any other questions?
Yeah,
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so interesting stuff. Also, as Prof mentioned, this could probably be applied to other things. So I just assuming it could be work with time. So I'm thinking students, especially with the 5 courses these days, is real struggle with time management. So I guess if you replace money with time, it should be a similar procedure.
That's true. Yeah, that's a good point. Thanks. I didn't think of that. So if you just, because I guess you would budget time in a similar way, right? You want to spend a certain amount of time on your subjects and then your personal stuff or whatever.
Yeah, and you could probably pull from Netflix or some of them anime sites or something.
Yeah.
Hey, can I watch Hawkeye? If it's a show that's rated to be binge worthy, then you're probably no.
Yeah. Because a timetable would be pretty too strict. But with this, you could do a kind of more flexible.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So interesting. Yeah. So I guess I'll be interested in extending it to that approach.
Cool.
So,
Hey, Reshawn.
Hey, Navan.
Yeah, I just have 2 questions, just out of curiosity. Did you have to record, or was there any trouble getting a response from the bots in terms of the length of time it took? Did they usually reply quickly? I'm not sure if it's an interesting thing I'm thinking about, because if a bot replies to me too quickly as well, I'll be suspicious. So yeah, I was wondering if you had to do anything with that.
So it's kind of passing through 2 or 3 APIs, because it goes through Facebook's API, then Dialogflow's API, and then our Firebase cloud functions, and then back to Facebook. So it's not super instant as it might be if it was just Facebook, a Facebook bot alone. there's a small delay, but it's still very clearly a bot. So it's not unsettlingly fast, if that's what you're asking for.
Okay. And well, I guess you didn't have to do much of the NLP part of this, right? But how easy would it be to scale to like different languages, but relatively remain the same? Would you need any amount to change from the model?
I'm not too sure what Dialogflow does to help with multi-language support, but yeah, you're right. Most of the NLP stuff is kind of just handled by their platform, and getting it for this purpose is kind of just preparing relevant examples, and like, so we would have, well, it was CIBC stuff, so I'm not sure how much I should talk about that part of it, but we
Right,
kind of would have made those decisions with their help and prepared certain questions to kind of train it for our use cases, if that makes sense.
All right, cool. Yeah, thanks.
Any other questions?
Okay,
terms
yeah, go ahead.
getting participants to take part in this survey for this project, were there any complications or any problems with people saying they don't trust a system like this, or anyone that was unwilling to participate?
I don't think so. No, that wasn't too big of a concern in the survey responses. It was a question that came up a lot, like in the planning of it, but not many people seemed to ask or express a lot of concerns about the about that stuff in the direct responses. In terms of getting participants, well, TT Lab helped a ton with that, so we didn't really have much problems there either.
Okay, cool. Thanks so much, and great work.
Thanks.
Anything else? Yeah, one other point is, there's a lot of effort to bring in the unbanked into the banking system, which is great. But when you do that, you tend to have people living in debt. Like in the US, for instance, the average credit card debt, I don't know, it was some ridiculously high number, couple thousand US, which means that basically, you're spending quite a bit of your money on interest. So getting people banked is important, but also teaching them to live without having to pay those heavy interest rates is important as well. So stuff like this will hopefully help in that respect.